promo to an event that's going to be happening coming up in May, the 2025 Ontario Biodiversity Summit, hosted by the Ontario Biodiversity Council, of which ISC is a proud member. We'd love to invite you to be a part of this summit at Trent University in Peterborough, Nagdawingnong. The summit's taking place over 2 days, May 21st and 22nd, and is going to bring together people from across Ontario to weave together different perspectives to help create our turning point for nature. Join hundreds of experts and peers working on biodiversity-related issues, and enjoy 2 plenary sessions, 20 concurrent sessions, and more than 10 indoor and outdoor networking opportunities at Trent University's beautiful campus. There are about 3 months left to register, and organizers have worked really hard to keep fees as low as they can. It's $200 for full-time students and $425 for standard participants, and there are reduced rates to support equitable participation. ISC will be there contributing to our turning point for nature, and along with all of the Ontario Biodiversity Council's other members, we hope that you can join us there too. You can find more information on the summit at a link that we can post in the chat. And we hope to see you there, like I said. With that, I will happily introduce our keynote speaker for the day, the last day of our conference this week. I'm pleased to introduce Emily Fusco. Emily is the Deputy University Director of the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center, based at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Emily earned her PhD in organismic and evolutionary biology from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. An expert in global change ecology and climate adaptation, she has held appointments at the University of Washington Climate Impacts Group and the USDA Forest Service Northern Research Station, where she conducted climate vulnerability and adaptation assessments and coordinated the Northwest Regional Invasive Species and Climate Change, or Risk Management Network. So welcome, Emily. Thank you. And I'll have you take it away so I don't take up any of your time to talk about this awesome topic.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you all for the invitation to come and speak today. I'm excited to get to talk with this group about invasive species and climate change and ways that we can adapt our thinking and our strategies as we experience this changing world. As Mac mentioned, my name is Emily Fusco. I am the Deputy University Director at the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. I am based at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. Before I get started, I am going to just let you all know ahead of time that most of the examples that I'll be going over today are plant examples. My background in invasion ecology has been largely focused on terrestrial plants. I'm also based in the US, so a lot of the work that I've done has also been based in the US, so a lot of my examples are going to come from there, but they will still be relevant to folks, in other areas as well. So I'm going to start with just a quick roadmap for today so that you all know what to expect. There will be 4 kind of main areas that we're going to cover. The first is going to be this quick overview of invasive species and climate change interactions. The next thing that we're going to talk a bit about is how we can adapt our language to help align our understanding as we see these invasive species and climate change interactions start to take shape. The next thing that we're going to talk about is some of the tools that we already have in our toolbox as invasion ecologists and invasive species managers, and thinking about how we can adapt those tools so that we can be proactive about our management in a changing climate. And then the last thing we're going to talk about are some of the ways that you can keep up with this quickly changing scene of invasion and climate change. New research and work is coming out every day, and so keeping up can be a little bit of a burden. And so we'll talk about some resources for you all to keep up with what's going on. So we'll jump in now with that quick overview of invasive species and climate change interactions. This is an infographic from the Northeast Regional Invasive Species and Climate Change Network. I'll talk more about what that network is later in the talk, but for now I want to really just focus on what's going on in this infographic. So these are some of the main ways that we expect invasive species and climate change to interact. One thing that we might expect to see is that we'll see these changes in phenology. So invasives may be able to emerge earlier or stay later into the growing season as climate warms. We may see invasive species shifting their ranges into new ecosystems. So maybe they're moving upslope, maybe they're moving to more northern latitudes as climate conditions change and may become more favorable. So you may start seeing invasives that didn't used to be a problem where you were, and they start making their way into your area. We may also see invasives introduced through new pathways. So one thing could be sea ice melt. Maybe that helps with connectivity between areas. We might see some invasives making their way in that way. We might also see changing recreation patterns, helping to bring invasives to new places. So there's all sorts of interactions there with potential new pathways. We might also see climate extremes. So a lot of our invasive species are very disturbance responsive. So as we have these extreme climatic events, we might see new opportunities for invasions to really take a hold in our systems that we're managing. There could be, there's some evidence to show that some invasives appear to be a bit more hardy with our herbicides when there's higher atmospheric CO2. And we also see that they're also very competitive under these warmer and higher CO2 conditions. And so again, this infographic was created in the Northeast. This is a similar infographic. It was created for the North Central. So, depending on where you are, so this is the North Central of the US, it might look a little different in how you see these things play out, depending on what ecosystems you're working in. But a lot of these concepts are going to carry and be relevant no matter where you are. All right, so that was just our quick little crash course on those interactions in invasive species and climate change. That's not the focus of today's talk specifically. So what we're gonna do now is jump into this question around language. So we can talk about how we can adapt our language and get on the same page when we're talking about invasive species and climate change. So there's a lot of confusion about how we're going to talk about these species, especially when we see that they are shifting ranges and we see that they're starting to have new or unfamiliar impacts. And some of this confusion stems around just poor communication and not having a shared vocabulary or shared understanding about what we expect to see or what we're already seeing. So the next several slides, these come from a collaborative effort with folks from across the Risk Network. And this was all in a paper that was recently published in the journal Trends in Ecology and Evolution. All right, so to talk about our language around invasives and climate change, we're going to start with some familiar terms. So the definitions of these words even have been debated, and they continue to be debated. But for the most part, a lot of folks are using these terms. We have some shared understanding of what they mean. And we can probably all at least agree that these terms are very often used in invasion ecology and management and policy. In climate, we have this kind of new invasive species and climate change lexicon that's begun to emerge over the last couple of decades. And so what these new words attempt to do is describe changes in species ranges and changes in their impacts. But there's a lot of ambiguity associated with these terms, and that has created a fair bit of confusion in how we talk about things, how we manage things, and how we apply our current policy and management efforts to species that we see doing these new things. And it's really important when we need, in some instances, very precise language to apply policy or management options. So rather than really push for a standardization of terms to talk about these things, we instead wanted to put together a framework for organizing these terms and pull everybody into this shared understanding of what it is exactly that we're seeing. So these are just some of these new words that you may have started to see pop into discussions, into papers, and maybe are a little bit confused about what exactly are people talking about when they talk about each of these things. And so to organize these terms and create this framework, we again started with those familiar terms that are generally shared. And so in an ecosystem or in a management area, you might, all of the species there might already have one of these designations, right? So they might be considered invasive, they might be a non-native and established species, or they might be considered a native species. But with climate change, for each of these, there are kind of two options. So either that species can stay where it is, or it can shift its range in response to climate change. And then for whether or not it's having any kind of negative impact in that ecosystem, you might expect that it either has a known negative impact that we care about or no known impact. So nothing going on that we're particularly concerned about. So both of these broad categories of whether there's an impact or whether something is staying or shifting, that can change with climate change. And so as we move into this situation of climate change, we might either, we could see no change in impact or movement. So that would be that blue color. We might see a change in only one of these two things. So that's that yellow color there. And then in some instances, we might see a change in both of those factors. So impact and movement change. And that's that orange color. So if you start off with a species in an ecosystem that has native status, and in response to climate change, it stays where it is and it continues to not have any kind of impact that we're concerned about, we would just continue to call that a native species, right? That's that blue color there. But it could also shift its range into a new ecosystem. And if it doesn't have any impact, some of the terms that we've seen, so these are not our terms, but people might call these climate tracking species, range shifting species, or neonative species. So those are all words that have been applied, but that refer specifically to this movement of a native species into a new range. If that species shifts and it starts to have an impact, that negative impact, you see that orange color there. So people might start calling that something like a nuisance neonative or a native invader. And then we also have this kind of yellow hashed box 1 here. We actually haven't seen any terms to describe the situation where a native species stays where it is, but then starts having an impact. One word that could be applied here is a nuisance native, but that doesn't really convey any information about what's going on with climate change. And so that's why that term there is in italics. So you can do the same exercise with species that are non-native and established. So they stay where they are, continue to have no impact. They're that blue box. They keep the same kind of designation. They could shift and probably keep that same designation because even in this new range, they're a non-native established species. In some cases, there's this term sleeper species that can be used to describe a species that was not having any impacts, but with climate change does have an impact. So that's a word that we're seeing kind of appear there. And then in this box 2, again, hashed out a bit there because we don't actually have any terms that we found that describe this specific situation, but people might just call this an invasive species. Again, that doesn't convey the climate component of what's going on, but that is potentially a term that could be used there. And then the same thing for invasive species. And so you see again that blue box, everything's staying the same, still call it an invasive. If it shifts, we'd probably still call it an invasive. It's a non-native that's having these negative impacts. But we don't really have any terms at all for an invasive species that appears to lose its ability to have impacts with a changing climate. And so this is just another area where maybe these are things that we should be aware of could happen, and maybe we want to develop some kind of shared understanding about how we would classify those species and what we would do with those species. We can also now look at 4 real-world examples and use them to talk about when getting a common understanding with our language is most important. And so each of these examples have varying amounts of climate change related ambiguity in how we have been talking about them, but they also have varying levels of disagreement in terms of an important management decision around these species changing their ranges or changing their impacts. And so we can use these different varying levels of ambiguity and consequence to talk about when it's going to be worthwhile to address that ambiguity as a way to mitigate the consequence. And the reason for trying to prioritize like this is because in some situations, addressing this ambiguity and getting on the same page is going to take a significant number of resources. And so we really want to focus on areas where this kind of confusion is going to have a lot of benefit to us to address. So the first example that we're going to talk about is the southern pine beetle. So this is a native insect that has its range has historically been south of New York State, but has moved into New York State as a result of climate change. But because it had native status further south, the species native status was really ambiguous. And so there was a really high disagreement in how the state was going to fund management of this species. And the reason for that disagreement was because some of the funding that they needed to be able to access or wanted to access required that species have non-native status in order to access that funding. And so there's a lot of confusion about how to actually treat this range shifting species as it was having these negative ecological impacts that they hadn't experienced before. And so what they had to do was they pulled together an expert panel, and eventually they determined that the species would be considered native. And so they weren't able to use that non-native species funding, but it required this expert elicitation panel and really these additional resources to determine even how to deal with this situation. And so here we see this kind of landing in the top right. So there was high ambiguity around how to consider this species, and the consequence was also high because they weren't able to access the funding that they were hoping to access. And there was just a lot of confusion around whether or not that was even an accessible path forward in that case. So this is maybe an example of where getting on the same page is probably the most important. So another example that we can look at is the golden jackal. So this is something this is a species that's expanded its range in Europe, largely in response to climate change. And there is some legal documentation to stipulate that native species that are shifting their ranges in response to climate change in Europe cannot be considered non-native. And so we have really low ambiguity about that. This is not considered a non-native species, but there's a huge range in response for how to manage the species. So both across and within countries where the species is shifting, there's actually a really big range between whether that species has protected status to huntable status. And so there's really low ambiguity here in the species native status, but there's really high disagreement about how that species should be managed. Our next example comes from the Pacific Islands. So this is about the Cabeus vine, and the native status across the islands is debated. On the specific island of Palau, it is considered a native species, but it has negative ecological impacts. It is shifting its range, and it may become even more problematic with climate change. So there's some high ambiguity around the species native status, depending on where you are in the Pacific Islands, and also some of the causes for the range shifts. But there's really low disagreement that this vine should be managed in Palau because it does have such a high negative ecological impact. So that brings us to this bottom right quadrant where there's high ambiguity, but still really low disagreement among managers about how that should, how management should take place. And then back in the US, we have another example here. So there's this, so the native white-tailed deer. So at high population levels, deer can have negative ecological consequences and negative ecological impacts. And as we experience these milder winters with climate change, we have seen and expect their populations and impacts to increase. But there's really low disagreement about whether, we can change harvest limits or change our very active management of deer populations to mitigate these negative impacts. And so that puts the deer in this lower left corner. And using this method, we can see that really out of all of these examples, the most strategic ones to address that ambiguity are what you might see fall out in this top right corner. So that southern pine beetle example. And so that can help us really resolve ambiguity and really figure out where we want to concentrate our resources for having these discussions. Yeah, so just to recap, so invasion terminology we saw is this rapidly evolving lexicon, and it's trying to accommodate these climate change interactions, and that's causing some confusion. What I showed you all is a framework that can help adapt our thinking to accommodate all of this proliferation of new terms. And we hope that by providing this kind of framework, really what we can do is allow people to use terms that make sense in their situations, but that we can have this shared understanding of what exactly we're referring to when we use these terms, and what are the ecological situations, these scenarios that we're seeing playing out when we use these different terms. And then also we showed this tool that you can use here to think about how we might want to prioritize investing our resources to resolve different levels of ambiguity in these changes and impacts and change in these shifting ranges in a way that those can be approached strategically. All right, so those were kind of a couple of new tools that might help adapt our thinking, but we also can talk about how we can maybe repurpose some of our old tools. So adapt our current toolbox to focus on more climate proactive invasive species management. So invasion ecology and management, there are already a ton of tools that we're using because we've been working on this problem for a very long time. We have a ton of innovative people working in their labs and in the field trying to work at managing ecosystems in a way that are most useful to us and biodiversity and all of these other values with invasion in mind. But with climate change, there are maybe some ways to take these tools and find new ways to use them. So it's a little bit like, turning duct tape into shoes, but hopefully some of these solutions are a bit more elegant. So the first tool that I want to talk about is just our knowledge about what makes a species invasive. So if we use this knowledge to think about our range shifting species again, we can start to think about what species we might want to advantageously encourage to go new places versus which species we might want to discourage. So southern pine beetle, for example, is one that maybe we don't want to facilitate the spread of that species. And so we can look at things like, propagule or dispersal pressure. So maybe really high fecundity species or, species with really high genetic diversity or a lot of propagules. That could be things that maybe we consider as having potentially higher impacts or high risk of impacts versus, species that are really endemic or really specialist species, right? So that might be something that has a much lower risk of impact as it's shifting its range. And so we have kind of this knowledge toolbox already to help evaluate species that are starting to move around. We also have invasive plant regulatory lists, and I know there are other kinds of regulatory lists that folks use outside of the plant world as well. I'm most familiar with these. And so these plant regulatory lists, they help prevent intentional movement of species that have been identified as high-risk species. So this is an example here from Massachusetts. The list is much longer than this. This is just a quick screenshot of, some of the, I guess, what we got through all of the A scientific names and a couple of the B's. So this is just the beginning of these prohibited plants in the state of Massachusetts that prohibit any kind of purchase, distribution, propagation, or related activities with these species. And on the left there, you'll see Tree of Heaven or Ailanthus. So this is an example of one of those species. So one of the things that we can do is use these regulatory tools that we already have in a climate proactive way. And so one thing that we considered was in the US, whether that's something that people were doing already. So what you're seeing here is a map of the United States with the number of each invasive plants or each invasive plant taxa within each state that's been listed proactively. So what we did is we looked at all of these invasive plant regulatory lists across the US and compared them with plant distribution data to see if these state regulatory lists were listing species proactively. And there were 36 states that did list species proactively. And there were 165 cases where a taxa was listed proactively within a state. And so what it means to be listed proactively is that it's on the prohibited plant list, but there's no known occurrence records of that species in the state. The color on here also, that indicates the percent of the species that were listed proactively in that state. So the dark blue states have a higher percentage of proactively listed species. But thinking about this in terms of climate, so if you want to think about the climate piece of this, we can also start to ask whether these were listed in a climate proactive way. And the way that we considered that was we used species distribution models based on future climate scenarios, which we had available for 65 of those cases. And so if a species was listed as not present, but would have suitable climate in that state in 2050, that was considered a climate proactive species. And so using that criteria, what we saw is that 41 of those 65 cases were climate proactive species. But out of those 41, 39 actually already have suitable climate there. So it could be that in these cases, it could that these species might have become more competitive with climate change. But it does show us that we do have this ability in a lot of cases to list species proactively. And there's potential there to also think about invasive species shifting their ranges and listing species proactively in that way. But it does show that we aren't really doing it yet. So tons of room for improvement on this one. So that really brings us to our next tool, which are these weed risk assessments. And weed risk assessments are important because they are one of the cornerstones for helping determine what goes on to our plant regulatory lists. And so we looked at all of these invasive plant lists throughout the Northeast, and we did find some criteria in those plant lists that would downgrade plants that don't already have suitable climate here. And so there are ways that we can rework these weed risk assessments to help include species in a climate proactive way. The chart here on the right side, what that shows are ways that we can increase proactivity in our plant regulatory lists and our weed risk assessments. So in the blue are all of the things related to proactivity and climate proactivity. So some of the suggestions here are to look at regulatory lists from your neighbors to the south. And so whether that means looking at a state that's further south than you, anybody that you share a border with further south, if you have kind of county level invasive plant lists, maybe you want to talk to people or look at lists in counties to your south to see if anything jumps out as being something that might come your way. Climate watch lists are an important tool as well. And so one thing that's being developed more and more are things like these species distribution models under climate change for climate change to see where we expect species to have suitable climate in the future. so we can incorporate these kind of climate watch lists into picking which species we want to evaluate to begin with. The other thing we can do to help determine priority, because sometimes these species, these lists can be really big and overwhelming. We can ask our neighbors for their weed risk assessments and hopefully get that information from them. So in the Northeast, we found that a lot of states are doing their own weed risk assessments and that they are, a ton of resources go into completing these. But if we can just share the information that we have, we can help with that process. And then by including all of these kind of climate pieces and talking to our neighbors in warmer places, we can hopefully make our regulations a bit more climate proactive and identify some of these potentially very problematic species. The last tool that I'm just going to go over briefly is just other policies. And so there are other policy pieces that don't necessarily deal explicitly with invasion. So we'll talk a little bit about climate policy here. And so in this example, we can talk about how climate policy could incorporate invasive species knowledge and priorities for more positive outcomes. And so if, for example, in your climate policy, there is a suggestion to plant more trees or plant more forests, but we plant trees that are, non-native or invasive trees these trees that might have negative impacts, this could be an opportunity to introduce invasive trees, and you end up in this win-lose climate situation. You could also end up with climate policy that reduces invasion risk. So maybe you might want to focus on species that have really low invasion risk. So in this case, maybe it's a win for climate and a neutral for invasion policy or invasion risk. These are just like non-native established species. They're not causing any negative impact. Or we can approach this from an area of trying to get a win-win situation. So maybe we can think about how we can create this climate policy with ecological benefits. So maybe planting trees that help range shift native trees that are going to enhance our climate change adaptation abilities. And you all probably noticed that a lot of these tools, or all of these tools, really focus on prevention. And that's because climate change gives us this unique opportunity to work in a preventative space, which we don't have with a lot of the rest of our invasion management. So that's a good thing, right? You all are probably familiar with this invasion curve. Our best chance at controlling invasive species is at this prevention mark. We're going to get the most bang for our buck here. Okay, so to do a quick recap of our tools here, the first we talked about was our invasion ecology knowledge. We can use that to assess our high-risk range shifters. We can also use our invasive plant regulatory lists to help list species in a climate proactive way. We can use our weed risk assessments to help us do that. And so one way to do that is by incorporating climate watch lists and information from your southern neighbors, and also making sure that your weed risk assessments aren't precluding you explicitly from listing species that don't currently have climate space in your management area, for example. And then the last piece here is the policy piece. So there's all sorts of other policy in this policy ecosystem. And so the example that we talked about was about how we can make our climate policy invasion smart, and we can also make our invasive species policy climate smart. So kind of making sure that we're not keeping these things super siloed, because we know that they're interacting, and we need folks from all of these areas working together to come up with policy that makes sense. Okay. So as we mentioned before, there's a ton going on with invasion and climate change, and it can be very overwhelming, especially for folks that are, out there on the ground removing weeds or dealing with these other very pressing, immediate challenges. And and it doesn't leave a lot of time for following what's going on in the scientific world, keeping up with what's going on with other people on the ground, and there may not be a lot of opportunity to share these stories and share what's working and not working. And so I'm going to just spend the last few minutes here talking about resources for making keeping up with these changes easier. And so I really want to focus on the Regional Invasive Species and Climate Change Network, so the Risk Management Network. We have now several networks established throughout the US and also a national network in Canada that's being stood up. All of these groups work together to create resources for invasive species and climate change to help everybody on the ground really share information with each other, have researchers and managers share information, and also to help develop research priorities. And there are a lot of resources that each of these groups develop. So this comes from the Northeast Risk website. Some of the resources that they do provide are these research to practice summaries. You might have seen them also called management challenges. And so what these are these two-pager documents that help summarize and synthesize information about different invasive species and climate change topics. So those initial infographics you saw about the interactions with invasive species and climate change, you can find full two-pagers on all of that information so that you can get a better handle on those specific interactions and see a bit more in depth about where that information is coming from. They also create research summaries. And so these research summaries are quick, a couple of paragraphs that explain the latest research on invasive species and climate change. And they also are focused on having management take home points too. So how these scientific papers and these scientific discoveries really are related to what's going on the ground. And I think in the Northeast, there's probably over 100 of these, maybe 150 of these, kind of spanning all of these topics. So changes in phenology, changes in biocontrol methods, all of that kind of stuff. There are also tool summaries that you can access. And so a lot of these, you all have so many tools that you're inundated with sometimes. And so knowing which tools are the most useful or how to use them can be a challenge. And so this offers some quick guidance on some of the tools available. And then all of the risk original research that exists would be on these. So I think almost all of the figures and papers that I just discussed are part of risk research. And so you would be able to get a hold of them there, at least a list of all of that research so that you can track it down. So you can get to the risk websites on risknetwork.org, and that would bring you to a landing page for all of the risk networks. And then you can kind of go out to your area of interest or region of interest from there. But I would encourage you to visit all of them, even if it's outside of your region, because, like I said, the Northeast has tons of information, for example, that is relevant in other places, and so do the other networks. All right, so just a quick recap from today. So we did this quick overview of our invasive species and climate change interactions. We talked about adapting our language to align our understanding. So we went through this framework that you can use to talk about how we're seeing species move and shift and change their impacts in a changing climate. And we also talked a bit about how to prioritize where getting a shared understanding and language is really the most important. We also talked about tools that already exist, and how to adapt them to make them more climate proactive. And then we talked a little bit about the risk networks, and I hopefully encouraged you or convinced some of you to visit those websites so that you can track down more resources there. All right, so with that, I will wrap up for today, and hopefully you've left some time for questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Emily. I love the presentation. I think you touched on so many things that I think we think about working with invasive species all the time, and gave some really great tools for us to implement and be able to incorporate climate change into our work and incorporate invasive species work into climate change as well, which is, I think, what the risk networks really do as well. And I saw some comments that they're great tools for all of us. I will do a quick plug. We're going to be participating in the Northeast Risk coming up next March. They have a symposium coming up. So really looking forward to that. Emily, there's been lots of great discussion in the chat about range shifting species and legislation, things like that. So I'm going to ask you if you want to check that out and see just what the conversation is like at some point. But there are a couple of questions coming into the question box that I'll just review quickly. And if there's anything else for Emily, please send the questions that way. First question, easy one. Are your slides going to be, can they be made available after if anybody can send you an email to be shared?
Sure, yeah, just go ahead and send me an email and I'll get you whatever slides you need a hold of.
We've been
and I think you all are recording the presentations too, so you'll be able to go back there and review any of this as well.
Awesome, yeah. And we've been adding our speaker emails to kind of an Excel document so that we'll share that at the end of the session. And then if you want to send Emily an email to ask any other specific questions or get slides or documents or infographics, whatever, you can do that afterwards. So Emily, Chris asked if you have an example of an invasive that will be more competitive due to increased CO2 in the atmosphere.
Oh, goodness. That's a great question. There is a paper associated with that I am having trouble recalling right now. But if you go to the Risk Network website and find that there's that management challenge called Double Trouble, where that is listed, those citations are available there. But I don't have an example for you right now.
Awesome. Thanks, Emily, for that suggestion. And then Kathy asked if you have any suggestions for how we can leverage this information to improve regulatory tools in Canada. A big question for you.
Yeah, that's a big question. So, I can talk about in the Northeast, one thing that's been done is that the Risk Network has worked a lot with the invasive plant councils of the states in New England. And these are the councils that are in charge of kind of these regulatory lists. And what we've done is we've worked with them to help develop the information that they need to start considering these climate proactive species. And so I think, the way that this worked was early on, we were at this place of, these groups just need a list of what species to even look at or consider. But it turns out that list is really long, right? And so then we had to go back and think a little bit more about, helping prioritize which of those species to look at. And so that's a little bit in that weed risk assessment chart, for example. There were those blue boxes. There were several options there of how to think about where to start looking and then how to start prioritizing those. And so, I think getting in touch with folks that have the resources to do that kind of analysis and figure those things out is really useful. And then also connecting them with the people that actually have the power to make those lists is the other big piece there.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Emily. And I know I've done some work on some kind of like threat analysis, kind of decision-making tools for prioritization. And this was a few years ago, so things have kind of changed a bunch in the climate change space, of course, but it's a difficult task to kind of incorporate those things and make them regionally specific and practical for the people that are using the tool. So it's a big task and it's a difficult one. And like you said, the lists of species are long and getting longer as kind of time goes on. So yeah, thanks for that question, Kathy. One more came in here. Do species distribution models account for species niches from recent urban spaces or invasion zones? This could potentially over or underestimate future risk estimates.
Yeah, and that's definitely true. So species distribution modeling has limitations like that, right? So there are a lot of different, variables that go into those models. And so you would need to look at what variables are going into the specific models you're using and how that might affect the spaces that you're looking at. And so one of the things that we did, with creating those watch list species, there's that initial modeling that goes into identifying species that would have suitable climate space. But then with further assessment, you can look more closely at, of those species, which ones actually might have suitable habitat in an area. And so you kind of have to drill down a bit more from there. But the distribution models at least give you that first cut at who you might want to start looking at.
Awesome. Thank you, Emily. I'm just going to do a quick scroll through the chat, see if I missed any questions from there amongst the discussion.
Yeah, there's so much going on in the chat. I'm trying to quickly see what's going on in here.
There was some love for the NR40 that you mentioned, the Wisconsin invasive species rule. And so maybe, I don't know, do you know much about that, Emily? Could you maybe give a bit of details on that legislation? Because I think people were kind of wondering a bit about it.
The Wisconsin legislation?
Yeah.
I don't know much about that one,
Okay.
no.
For people wondering, a couple of people put some links in the chat if you're curious.
Okay.
Matthew had put some links in the chat there earlier. Okay, awesome. Well, I don't see any further questions there in the chat for you, Emily. If you want to check it out yourself further, please feel free. Otherwise, we're going to move into our invasive species trivia session. Quite exciting. We're going to be staying here in this session. So if you're hanging out for trivia, we've got like 3 minutes, so you can take a quick break before we get started. Otherwise, we'll stick around and we'll see you in a few minutes. Thanks again to Emily for her great talk and giving us some great inspiration for our work as well.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks, Emily. And I'm just going to go off camera here and we'll see you back in a few minutes for trivia.
Hi everyone. I see we are at 120. So I just snagged MC hosts from Mackenzie for a very brief period of time to get started with invasive species trivia. Um, I'm gonna go ahead and start sharing my screen. For those of you who are unfamiliar, we are using Kahoot, so you have to have a smartphone, some type of smart device, or your computer ready. So please have that with you. I hope to heavens that our Kahoot plan can handle all of you. I'm so excited to see how many people are here and wanting to flex their invasive species knowledge. So I hope that we can make it work. Otherwise, please answer and put in the chat and brag to people about how good you are, even if you aren't on our Kahoot there, or even if you don't want to be on our Kahoot, that is a lovely option for you. So let's get started and hope that I also remember to share the sound.
Lauren, I'll monitor the chat for answers.
Oh, lovely. Okay, so we have an adjudicator as well, which is always fun. Okay, let's hit start here. I'm hoping, Mackenzie, if you can indicate if my screen is okay.
Looks great. Looks like we're waiting for players.
Awesome. Okay. So again, for those folks who aren't familiar, you can either have the Kahoot app. If you don't have that already, you can go to www.kahoot.it on your smartphone or on your computer, or you can scan the QR code. Then you just enter this game pin here, which is 483753. And then it'll ask you for a fun nickname, which you can see here. People tend to use all types, which is awesome. But I'm so excited to see so many people online. I feel a little bit nervous, a little bit of pressure now, but I'm sure we're going to have a fun time. I'm going to give it a few more minutes, as I know lots of people are filtering in. I guess I'll do my Kahoot 101. It's not only the right answers that count, it's also the speed at which you get the right answers. So no, not to add any pressure, but fast thumbs tend to be an advantage for this game. I can't hear, Max, so if this is egregiously loud, please let me know. But if the volume is okay, then I will leave it.
I wouldn't say it's egregiously loud.
Okay. For some reason, I can't hear my own volume when I share screen, but that is a technical problem for another day. I think we're probably going to set a new Kahoot player record here. I don't think we've ever had this many people on. So yeah. We'll give it maybe until 125 because I know it takes a little bit of time to get yourself set up. Lots of fun names here, which I'm very excited about. I see lots of our
Frag Mighty.
Yeah, that is fun. We have a frag fighter. We have lots of frag folks on, which is fun. I'll do a little scroll as we're waiting until 125. I like Speedy Goose. That's fun. I could have fun just looking at the nicknames here. Okay, last call for folks online who are wanting to join in. Please use that web address above or scan the QR code, enter the game pin, enter your name, and we're about ready to get started.
And if you're not on Kahoot, just pop your answers in the chat too.
Exactly, yes. Mackenzie will be moderating the chat. So, this is a fun break in the day. So please use that to your advantage and just have a little bit of fun. We'll go back to Angela's talk yesterday on how she, really proved the point that having a little bit of fun within your workday can go a long way. So we're 125 now, so I'm going to Lots of Phragmites. I think we have like maybe a frag competition, a little bit of a battle starting, so that's exciting. Without further ado, I'm going to start the game. Big shout out to the Invasive Species Center team too, who did come up with most of these questions. I could take very little credit for that. Okay, which invasive insect, first detected in Canada in 2002, has caused significant damage to ash trees?
Oh, the answers are coming in so fast.
I know, this is crazy. Yay! Emerald ash borer is the answer here. So let's see who's going to take an early lead. CK, okay. I like the mystery of it all. So I'm not sure who you are, but congrats on taking the first lead.
BLD in fourth place is obviously a forest pest person.
Yes, definitely. Okay. Next up, true or false? Zebra mussels are an invasive species that can clog water intake pipes and damage infrastructure. You guys are so fast. This is crazy. Yay! Yes. As many folks may know, especially after our talk yesterday, our aquatics talks, and zebra mussels cause a lot of troubles. Let's see who's in the lead now. Oh, we have some shifting. Mickey, you're on top, but CK didn't go very far. And BLD, hanging on. Next question, which invasive fish species is known for its jumping behavior? Yes, silver carp. This is so fun to see how everyone is getting them all right, which I expected no less. So it's a little bit tricky because you also got to answer fast. So Frank, congratulations, you're up there. CK, though, still holding strong at second place. Next up, I'm an invasive fish with a suction cup mouthful of teeth. I latch onto fish, feeding on their blood and body fluids.
I think there was a presentation about this yesterday.
I know, I think I remember one briefly. Yes, so that would be the invasive sea lamprey. The image before was from one of our Valentines, so that's why it appeared more friendly than maybe it should be. Okay, we kind of have some leaders getting up here and staying here. So let's see who can knock them down. Next question. Oh, this is apparently double points. If Shrek lived in the swamp invaded by Phragmites, what would he say?
I love this question.
I love this for double points too. Like
Better out than in.
I am very, very excited that all of you said that. I mean, I feel like I could make a play for any of them, except for maybe Don't Care. But yes, I think he would surely say to get out of my swamp. Okay, that was a big movement one on there. Frank still holding strong at the top, but lots of others here in contention. Next question. Which invasive plant with umbrella-like clusters of white flowers poses health risks to Canadians? And I guess beyond, not just Canadians. Wow, yes, that would be giant hogweed.
Nearly 100% correct.
I know. I feel like we were a little tricky with this one because they were like, good questions, but it was the speed. Okay, a little bit of movement there, but these top 5 have been here for quite a while. But Phragmites is climbing down here, so congrats to you. Next question, which of these is not an invasive species? And for any entomologists, maybe you can tell me what this photo is actually of. It's not of a northern giant hornet because I can see the puzzle pieces. But yes, it would be the eastern yellowjacket. I guess I'm very sorry for those who are maybe outside of Canada. I should have quantified that this was in Canada because obviously these are native to other parts of the world. But in this case, we were talking about the eastern yellowjacket. Oh, AIS fighter. You're moving up there.
Kristen O making a big move up.
Yeah, wow. Okay. Let's see what we can do in the next question. I am known for the red patch of color behind my eyes. I was once a pet before I was released into the wild. What am I? These questions, like before we even get to the question screens, they're just flooding in. This is so exciting. Yes, this would be the red-eared slider, very aptly named, and kind of a poster child for the Don't Let It Loose campaign that the Invasive Species Center, along with several other agencies and organizations in Canada and beyond, promote. Okay, I'm glad to see AIS Fighter is still there because that question was for you. Okay, and Leaves too, making a big move. Okay, next question. In the video game Animal Crossing: New Horizons, which invasive species can escape cultivation and spread quickly?
See, video games can support your work.
Exactly, for anyone whose bosses tell them otherwise. This one would be Lily of the Valley. I am not an animal crosser myself. However, a nod to whoever put that in there because it seems like it is also an invasive species in the game, which is interesting. Okay. Again, top 5 pretty steady, but there's some folks here who are starting to make a come up. True or false? Invasive species cause an estimated 3.6 billion in economic damage annually in Ontario alone. We have our nice Canadian colored money here. Yes, that is true. We have several economic impact reports on our website. So if you have any more interest in where this specific figure came from or some others, please don't hesitate to check that out. We also had a great presentation yesterday from Ross Cuthbert of Queen's University Belfast, who also did a nod to invasive species economic impacts globally. So there's my tie all around back to this forum. Okay, Christina moving up here onto the leaderboard. And lots of folks have answer streaks, which is very exciting. Next question, true or false? Zebra mussels cannot attach to boats and survive being transported to new waterways. And that is very false. As many folks know, zebra mussels can attach to boats and other types of watercraft and gear and survive and be transported to new waterways. So another plug to Clean Drain Dry. Okay, a little bit of movement, but still pretty steady up here. Planty, though, is making a comeback, so go Planty. Next question. In the video game Minecraft, which invasive plant can be found and used for crafting? Very mixed on this one. A little bit of a trick question, but none of these are included in the Minecraft game.
I'm not something new about people on our team today.
That we have Minecrafters.
Yeah.
Yeah, very fun.
And very good at making connections to invasive species in video games.
Exactly. Yes, our team, our lovely team who came up with these questions. So yeah, they're making those connections everywhere they go. Christina here, though, that's a big move. So Christina, congrats being on the shop. We have some dogs strangling vine. I'm assuming that that's what your acronym means. Making in the top 5 as well. True or false? Asian longhorn beetles are named for their long legs. Yes, so they are named for long things, but it is not their legs. It would be their long horns. Sorry, that was probably a terrible joke, but we'll move on. Okay, no movement in the leaderboard at all, but lots of players hitting streaks, so maybe next question. Which invasive plant known for its tall, feathery plumes has invaded wetlands in Canada and other areas? And that would be Phragmites, as many of our players on here have indicated they are battling against.
We'll see if any of our mighty fraggers.
Yeah. Maybe they're one of the ones who have a streak, but none in the leaderboard as of yet. Next question. What invasive fish native to Europe has disrupted ecosystems in the Great Lakes? And I believe, not to give away a hint, we had quite a few talks on this yesterday in our aquatic session. And that would be the round goby. Oh, of course the AIS fighter is back up here because that was an AIS question. True or false? Japanese knotweed is an invasive plant that can grow through concrete and damaged buildings. And I think we just had talks about this morning. That is very true. As several of our speakers indicated, it's a pretty hardy plant that can grow through lots and lots of things. Okay, no movement in the leaderboard this question. Why are round gobies harmful to native fish in Canada? Yes. So to all of you who answered some of the other questions, you are technically right as well, but they impact native fish in all of these different ways. Alrighty. Getting close to the end here, folks. Which invasive plant is often referred to as Mother Nature's revenge for causing painful burns when touched? Giant hogweed is getting its moment to shine. I guess that's called Mother Nature's revenge, although true for wild parsnip as well. Wow, lots of movement there. Leaves, that makes sense. That makes sense. Which invasive species is nicknamed the walking fish because it can survive on land for several days? And if you're like me, you also just found this out recently and are a little bit creeped out. Yes, so that would be the northern snakehead. Okay, a little bit of movement here, and Jen is on a hot streak here. 19 correct answers. No pressure for this next one. You just bought a new goldfish, not the snacks. What do you do?
It's a really tough one.
I know. This one is a little silly. There was no points actually involved, so it won't impact the game, but I was just in a mood to really hammer home the don't let it loose message. So yeah, you won't see any movement there, but thank you all for contributing to that. I wish we were all in the room together and we could just like chant, don't let it loose. but maybe at another event. Okay, second last question. Which invasive species has razor-sharp shells that can cut swimmers' feet and clog water pipes? Here's my question for this. Do we know that mermaids don't have razor-sharp shells that can cut swimmers' feet? I don't know. We might need some more research in that section. But yes, we were referring to zebra mussels. Okay, a little bit of movement, but Jen is still up there. So wait, this is our last question. So get those fingers and thumbs ready. True or false? Double points. The house sparrow is native to North America. Yes, so the answer is false. It is an invasive species. So let's get ready for our podium here, see where everyone landed. In third place, we have Katie S. In second place, we have Mickey. And in first place, drum roll please, we have Jen. So congratulations to everyone who played today. I hope everyone, if nothing else, had a lot of fun playing along. And I usually bop along to the music, but I couldn't hear it this time. So sorry to disappoint anyone who was expecting that. But Jen, if you can go into the chat and reveal yourself and pop your email into there, even if you want to just private message me or the backstage or anything like that. Or if that's not your jam, you can also email us at events@invasivespeciescenter.ca. I don't know, Mac, if you can keep an eye on the chat and maybe put our email into there. We do have some fun prizes to send your way for being the winner of our invasive species trivia event. So I will give you a couple of minutes to do that while I stop sharing and just give you a little bit of insight into our afternoon. So we are wrapping up the Invasive Species Forum, which is always a little bit crazy. I feel like I live in this event permanently now by this point of the week. But we will be doing that with two very, very exciting and probably some of the sessions I'm most excited for. We have the two climate change and biodiversity sessions following this, and I think Emily set us up beautifully for those. And I believe we have two other risk folks who will be joining us. So again, please join us back here at 1:50. And Jen, our winner, if you haven't yet already, please send us an email, pop it in the chat. We'd really like to recognize you for that. But with that, I will say thank you everyone for joining Invasive Species Trivia. It is a record amount of people that we have on here, so I'm so glad we all got to take this break and have a little bit of fun together. But we will see you back in about 7 minutes to chat some more about climate change and biodiversity. Thanks, everyone.